All right, welcome back, everyone. So we have our next speaker up, who is Candida Moreira, and she will be talking about from textbook BPDer to therapists helping BPDers. Candida is a neurospicy relational trauma therapist, writer, and TEDx speaker who thrives at the intersection of language and feelings, having met the criteria for a BPD diagnosis at a time when it was still considered hopeless. Candida is passionate about smashing stigmas and encouraging folks to move through the world fully owning all of who they are. She has a knack for complicating things, coloring outside the lines, and taking the scenic route. Welcome.
Thanks, Bailey, and thanks to everyone watching for being here. Um, I had a hard time deciding what to talk about. I was trying to narrow it down, and really, part of me wanted to show up with sort of one of those neatly packaged stories of healing and transformation, and maybe like a step-by-step guide. But I think what I decided ultimately was that I would talk about my relationship to the label and the stigma because I came into this. I can't believe I've been immersed in this world for over 20 years. Like we're talking, it was the early 2000s. And now when I think about it, it almost seems like the dark ages compared to where we are now in terms of what we know about trauma and how we talk about mental health. But the one thing that hasn't changed that much, or doesn't seem like it, is the stigma, and particularly from within the field. And so I thought I would share a bit about my story with the label and the diagnosis and how I got from there to here where I work with BPDers. It's my favorite.
Wonderful.
So I first came across the label. I was about 24, and I don't actually remember where I saw the book I Hate You Don't Leave Me or how it got into my hands, but I remember that sort of feeling of relief and horror at recognizing myself in the words and just being like sort of coming up into this description that made sense of an experience that hadn't made sense, but also seeing it there in black and white in this really sort of pathologizing way was not the best feeling. And then I remember the line, borderlines don't have empathy, and feeling really confused by that. And I remember underlining it and thinking, but that's not me. And then when I went to my psychiatrist that I was working with already at the time to treat my depression and anxiety, and he corroborated my suspicion of BPD, I just assumed I was wrong about my empathy. And clearly the professionals and the experts would be right. So I started therapy, and it was kind of a confusing experience. I felt so seen and cared for by this person, and then I'd be infuriated by her. And of course, now I have a really different understanding, but she would be dropping her CBT phrases on me. And, one that she would say all the time was, happiness is a choice, or suffering is optional. And all I heard was, you're not trying hard enough to change how you feel and all of that. And so it was really tough because I just felt like, here's this person trying to help me. She's great. She seems to care. And I show up week after week after week and nothing is changing. And I'm clearly not getting it. Like the problem in my mind, the problem was still residing within me. And I wasn't trying hard enough or working hard enough. So I worked with this therapist for, I think it was about 5 years. And I just kept coming up against her lack of understanding and knowledge. And I think it's really important to clarify, like, this was not a lack of effort or care. This was not a therapist who wasn't doing a good job. This was just misinformation, lack of training. We didn't have the understanding of trauma back then that we do now. But of course, I didn't know that. And so it was just this barrier that I kept coming up against. And I was just feeling more and more like I'm failing my therapist. I am showing up and wasting her time. I am the most broken person on the planet and clearly beyond help. And I just, I kept, that was my narrative for a really, really long time. So I was working, studying full time. I had a big social circle, and like nobody knew about my internal experience except for my then therapist and a couple close friends. But I was in this constant state of like analyzing my behaviors and trying to figure out what happened. I was doing like chain analysis before I knew about chain analysis or what it was, or and I would, I'd have these episodes, be on the roller coaster, and then I'd come out of it and experience this extreme shame and sadness and confusion and guilt and regret, and then I'd go and I'd apologize and try and explain the best I could understand it, but then it would happen again. And so it's almost like each time that it would happen and I'd come back and apologize, not only were the people on the other side getting less patient and less believing of the apology, I was too. Like, I couldn't stop these explosions that kept happening. Of course, also I'm starting my master's program and getting more information about BPD that's further embedding this narrative, this problem story of like, this is a hopeless condition, I'm gonna be plagued with this for the rest of my life. I'm a monster, I'm manipulating people. And I really believed that I was consciously manipulating people before I understood, what was really happening. In the master's program, we had in the psychopathology class, we were asked to write a paper, the pick your disorder paper. I think everybody has to do that. And so of course I picked BPD, and I remember my classmate picked it also because she had a roommate with BPD, and she got 100% on her paper and I did not. And I was outraged at this. And one of the things so what I did for the paper was I got permission to write it as more of like a creative fiction kind of thing, and essentially shared my story. And I included almost word for word like this diary entry where it was, just after one of these episodes where I'd been hijacked, triggered, and, yelled vitriol at someone. And I was writing about my shame and my regret and how I felt like something took over and all of this stuff. And this professor, who was one of like a great professor and who I really liked, made a lot of comments about my understanding of BPD, but when it got to that specific diary entry, he wrote beside it, "This would never happen. BPDers don't have empathy." And it was, even now, like I could still feel how it felt back then. It was like a slap, right? I was like, but this is me. And then I was even more confused. It's like, do I not have BPD? Do I not have empathy? Which one is it? Because apparently you can't have both. So I'm just immersed in this world of like CBT. And the other thing that would happen a lot with both the first therapist and the next therapist I went to, and even like other colleagues in the field, was this refusal to even use the label. And I was met with a lot of like, oh, I don't believe in labels. And of course I understand, and I believe that, their intention was to be supportive, right? And to not want me to associate with that label. But what the unintended consequence of that was just reinforcing the stigma, right? And also, for any clinicians out there, let your clients language their experience in a way that makes sense to them, right? Like, don't take that away from people trying to make sense of a very complex and bewildering experience. And so that was another thing that I kept coming up against, was both like, I'm not calling you this and I don't associate with this label, and also by all means do not disclose this label to anyone. So as I started working in the field and getting more experience under my belt, I was still in struggle, but less and less. And I wish I had, a linear explanation of like what happened and what changed. But, as we know, it's just a lot of like 10 steps forward and 4 steps back. But around 4 years into that first therapeutic relationship, we were in this cycle of rupture and repair. And it was just me splitting constantly on her, leaving angry voice. I was doing all the things that make clinicians not want to work with BPDers. I was leaving incessant voicemails and emails and counseling sessions. I remember one session, this poor woman, just being so triggered. And we would do out sessions because I would get so shut down and dissociated in office. So we would sometimes like go out into the world, and we were sitting outside, I don't even remember where, somewhere downtown. And I got so triggered, and I got up and I left, and basically was like, I'm going home to kill myself, and like walked down some alley and took off and went home. And as much as I couldn't get ahead of those behaviors, part of what helped them persist was that she continued to allow them, right? There was a real lack of consistency on her end of like what was okay and what wasn't. And 1 minute this was the rule. And I think she was just really trying to accommodate my needs, but it was so confusing to my borderline brain. So eventually the relationship was just imploded. Oh, sorry, one more thing. During this time, I started my practicums as well. And the clinical work immediately, I loved it. And I would get positive feedback really consistently. And I noticed, for example, that I could be in the depths of despair, but if I had a client, it would just pull me out of that, and I could show up for clients without issue. Where I was struggling was around more administrative stuff and doing my notes and showing up for admin meetings. So my then therapist suggested that I talk to my supervisors and disclose to them about the BPD. And so thankfully, I did it in the order that I did. And my first practicum supervisor, I was doing my practicum at male survivors of sexual abuse. And I don't know how it came out of my mouth. I was so anxious and nervous. I was so sure that as soon as I said the words, something horrible would happen. And he just took a moment and he looked at me and he said, "It makes sense that it's so easy for you to sit in the dark with people." And I have hung on to those words my entire life since then, right? And that really, his ability to still see me as me and not, something else just because of that label was so powerful. Unfortunately, the next supervisor was not quite so understanding. And in fact, he did on a dime change his mind about me. And so where previously he had positive feedback for me, my clients continued to only have positive things to say, he started expressing his concern that I wasn't present for clients, even though nothing in the clinical work was different. So that was really discouraging and unsafe. So I actually ended up seeking out private supervision and paying for it for the rest of my practicum, because it was so important to me that I was doing good work and that I wasn't letting my stuff get in the room. Like, that was the most important thing for me from the beginning. And I took that so seriously. And I think that that's a big part of how I was able to continue to show up and do the work. But the assumption that just because I had this label, I was suddenly not going to be able to be present for clients was, that was hard. So I look back now and I actually feel really impressed with my younger self, because I was so attached to that therapist, and like, she was probably like, I didn't know the language FP back then, but for sure she was my FP, and yet I knew at like a deeper level that this wasn't helping. This was just making things worse for me. And so I ended the relationship, and I arrived at my next therapist with a list of don't do's. Like, I was like, don't let me email you, don't let me cancel my appointments, or if I do, don't let me reschedule. Like, I kind of took all the things that hadn't worked in that previous relationship and brought them to the next one. But this whole time, I still felt this lack of understanding. Like, nobody really got it. And even though this second therapist was much more consistent and stable and grounded in her approach, she still resisted the label. And like, when I would use that kind of language, it was clear like it wasn't landing. It was so hard. And remember, this was the dark ages. Like, there was no social media. I couldn't just go. I couldn't find anyone. And I was pretty involved in the field. Like, I was volunteering at conferences, and I had connection to a lot of other therapists in the field, and I was constantly asking, do you know anyone? And, you know, the thing I wanted even more than someone who knew about it to help me, was I just wanted to know that someone had come out the other side. That was like, I didn't believe it was possible. I had my therapist telling me I could get better. I had literature telling me it was hopeless. I just wanted to meet someone who'd come out the other side, and there was nobody. There was nobody. Some therapists I'd reach out to and be like, "Do you know anyone who works with BPD?" And the response would be like, "What's BPD?" And it was just bewildering. Um, but eventually, I think when I kept looking, and I found the STEPS program. I don't know if you're aware of it. Systems training. Yeah, it's a mouthful, right? Yeah. But that was sort of the first thing I came across that had a really validating description of my experience. And there was sort of this description of like carrying a backpack with the wrong supplies in it, or whatever. And I was just like, wow. And I reached out to, the woman's name was Nancy Blum, and she was in Iowa. And I reached out to her, and all I wanted to know was, do you think someone with BPD could be a therapist? And she kind of replied vaguely in the affirmative, but she didn't really say yes. So I still was like doubtful and worried. But eventually, a few years later, I drove to Seattle and I saw Marcia give a talk and submitted the same question, like anonymously. And she gave like a resounding yes. And that really like charged me and gave me a lot of hope. But I was still on the roller coaster, right? And I was still having these explosions. And so maybe not so much with my therapist anymore, but the people in my personal life, I was still having these explosions and this back and forth. I think for me, even though there was one part of me in this narrative of like, I'm the worst person in the world and never gonna get better, I'm awful, and there was another part of me that knew that that wasn't true, and it was really driving the bus. And it was when I started working with kids and families that things really, like, I had my aha moments about my own internal emotional path. And so I was working with this delightful boy. He's 7 years old, and I just loved working with him, did a lot of play therapy and really enjoyed it. And every time I would have to do work with him and mom, or just mom alone, I would leave those sessions feeling kind of agitated and irritated. And that was really unusual for me. Like, I really enjoyed the work, and I didn't often feel bothered by clients. And so, of course, I went to supervision, and through those conversations, recognized that I also had this voice that was just like this mom, who very much wanted to make her child digestible and smaller and tone him down, and all of these things that I sort of also was trying to do, or that were kind of coming up inside of me. And so, and we didn't, like, I didn't know about IFS, parts language, any of that, but there was something in that aha that allowed me to separate a bit from the part of me that was being activated and triggered, and kind of losing it, and understanding that part as a younger part, or as a child part, was, I think, for me, the beginning of integrating and really healing that part. And then it became the thing that, again, still didn't know about parts work, when I started working with clients with BPD, in that first session, naming that toddler part, I would call it, and just watching clients feel so much relief, and that shame just melting away at the site, briefly, but just melting away in that moment of like, oh, so I'm not a monster and a horrible person. It's just this thing that's happening in my brain where my prefrontal cortex goes offline. And so I'm really grateful that I had that opportunity to work with kids and families. Like, I would never have known that would have been sort of the catalyst to understanding why I was doing what I was doing, or behaving the way that I was. But even still, there was no, like, I wasn't seeing or meeting anyone talking about lived experience with BPD. And in fact, I don't even think Marcia's article had come out. Like, there was an article in the New York Times where she kind of like came out, but I think that was like 2011. And by that time, I was not feeling like I really met the criteria anymore. So I was almost angry that, she hadn't come out sooner, but of course she hadn't. Like, look at the way we talk about it, and the stigma is so bad. Uh, Sorry. Oh, and yeah, so shortly after that, though, so this was definitely after her article had come out, and I think once the article came out, at first I didn't really think about my disclosing. Like, I just started disclosing. I was like, well, if she can do it, I'm going to do it. And then I was going to I was applying for a job to work exclusively with BPDers, and every single person supporting me in that application, writing my reference letters, told me not to disclose. I didn't really understand. Like, I was like, but how would that be a bad thing? Like, they're hiring people to work with people like me, and I'm me. So, but it was still, but that they were insistent. Like, they were really like, I would not recommend it. But I don't have to do what I'm told. And so, of course, I disclosed. And I did not get a call or an interview. And I can't say with certainty that that's why, but I feel pretty confident that's why. Because any job I applied for where I didn't disclose, I absolutely got an interview, right? And so it's sad to think that there's such stigma from within the profession. And I wish for clinicians to really understand and be able to meet BPDers and all their, like, as a series of parts, and really understanding that the manipulations or the what get called attention-seeking behaviors are just an expression of the only thing that person has access to in that moment, right? Like, it's there's a line from, I think it's Ross Green. It's like an absence of skill, not will, And I wish for folks wanting to work with BPD or considering it is get to know parts work, get to know trauma, and unknow or unlearn what you've heard about BPD, right? Like, there's just so much misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of, that sort of, uh, one other thing that I thought was around the disclosure was how in other parts of the field, like say in addiction and with recovery, that's actually part of recovery culture, right? Is sharing lived experiences and disclosing. But there's something about BPD that just sets people off into a lot of fear, right?
Yeah.
Misunderstanding.
Yeah, and I know that we talk a lot about like DBT as an evidence-based treatment, and for sure it is. And I'm curious for like folks that may be listening and thinking like, well, DBT didn't work for me, and I'm wondering
Yeah,
like, is there other modalities that or other ways of healing that you yourself was helpful for, or like your clients?
absolutely. So I often joke that for me, DBT feels like the math of therapy. Like, that's my experience when not like, I think it's great, but for my personality and for a lot of like creative folks that I work with, it can feel like math. So one thing that I often recommend for clients that I also found really helpful is, it's kind of a little bit of an obscure reference, but it was a book called The Desire Map by Danielle Laporte. And it kind of walks you through setting goals based on how you want to feel. And it's a great way to develop some emotional awareness and vocabulary and language or experiences. And then in terms of modalities, I think that for me, like, somatic work was huge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, having a somatic practitioner who really helped guide me into connecting to my body and where I was experiencing things and feeling that. I did not experience IFS as a client during the time I was struggling, but man, and I'm glad for that because it taught me the things I need to know. But I feel like, and see in my experience in my work, that parts language and that framework really fits for a lot of BPDers and really provides space to heal, right? Like, because the shame is just so big and loud and intense. But something about naming those different parts allows that to dissipate a bit, and that then gives enough room for the relational experience in therapy, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I've also seen that too, like within myself and working with folks too, the all the modalities and ways of healing that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other
And
thing that I think is, oh, sorry, just one other thing that I think is really important for clinicians is to also validate suicidal feelings. I think there was someone earlier who talked a bit about that. But
Mhm.
this idea that validating that I'm suicidal is somehow going to make me more suicidal, whereas of course it makes sense if you're constantly experiencing a level and depth of pain that other people don't know or see or understand. Of course your brain is like, ugh, let's just end it. Like, there's a comfort in that fantasy of it being able to end, and if you can, as a clinician, hold enough space for the dialectics, right? Like, yeah, there's a part of you that's like, I just want out. This sucks. And there's another part of you that's like upset that it sucks because you want to be alive, right? And so that's another piece that was, I certainly didn't talk about the suicidal feelings except for when I was exploding, like I never felt safe to really bring them up. I was also learning that if I brought them up, I might get an ambulance to my door, right? And so
Mhm.
yeah, just for
I think there's still
clinicians
a
out
lot
there.
of fear around
Pardon
it.
me?
I think there's still a lot of fear around it.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so a lot of times people think they immediately have to phone like emergency services. And then, of course, there's some instances where you may need to do that. But I think if there's more of an understanding around, like, especially like passive suicidal ideation, like chronic passive suicidal ideation, understanding when it turns into active suicidal ideation, especially with people with BPD. Yeah, just bringing a lot more like awareness around that is really important.
Yeah. I often like to frame it for clients and loved ones. If you think of your brain as having like a spinner, like, when we play Twister and there's a spinner, there's just as much chance you're going to land on suicidal as any other feeling. And we don't have to make it this bigger, scarier feeling. It's a feeling like any other. And in the context of a BPDer's experience, it makes absolute sense. Right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I'm just thinking if anyone has any questions as we're wrapping up, you're always welcome to post them in the chat. Uh, and yeah, maybe a good place to conclude would just be asking about like any gifts or strengths that you see for folks that have BPD. We talk a lot about like these labels about like manipulative and attention seeking and the kind of the negative aspects that you hear from the stigma around it. So yeah, maybe a good way to
Well,
finish there.
I mean, in my experience, BPDers are generally some of the kindest, most compassionate people I've ever met, right? And so I think underneath all of the stuff, there's usually a really generous and tender heart. I think BPDers are extremely creative problem solvers, right? I think they don't get enough credit for their ability to solve their problems and meet their needs as best they can with really limited capacity initially,
Mhm.
right? And persistent, right? I find there's a lot of persistence, perseverance, like the ability to like really tolerate a lot and kind of play the long game. Uh, and noticing things that others don't, seeing things that aren't there, like not that aren't there, but like that aren't as obvious.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's just a
Yes,
very unique moment. Pardon me?
yeah, like that attunement that comes when
The
being in a
attunement.
habit.
Yeah. Yeah, like when it's not getting hijacked by the hypervigilance, that attunement is so powerful, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
And for
Yeah.
clinicians, remember, these are some of the most self-aware clients that you could ever work with, right?
Mhm.
Because we both through the years have spent a lifetime trying to understand themselves already. Right?
Yeah, definitely. And very resourceful.
Very resourceful. That's right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us and provided us inspiration and hope and going from a BPDer to a therapist working with BPDers. And I appreciate your insight. We've known each other for quite some time now. Like it was 10 years
It's
or
been a
something.
while now, yeah.
Kind of like flow in and out of each other's lives. And so, yeah, I really appreciate seeing you again today. And also, yeah, you can check out more information. Looks like you have your Insta tag there at the Feelings Whisperer. And yeah, so, how many years have you been working as a therapist? We had a question in the chat there.
I think 18 or 19. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much
Hey,
again.
thank you so much.
Time. Okay. Take
Bye.
care. Yay. All right. Well, we have our last presenter of the day coming up, but don't leave after that because we do have a closing interactive event after. So we have our last presenter at 5 p.m. and then we have a closing interactive event at 6 p.m. as we do every year. So stay tuned for Amanda Smith at 5 p.m.